When we hear about the Roman Empire, the first thing that usually comes to mind is grandeur, invincible legions marching to the rhythm of war drums, emperors crowned with golden laurels, marble columns that still stand defying time, and a legacy of architecture, law, and culture that seems eternal. Rome has been taught to us as the cradle of Western civilization, as a beacon of order, progress, and power. But what if that image isn't the whole truth? What if, behind that glorious facade, Rome concealed a far darker face, one stained with blood, violence, and oppression? Behind the speeches about civilization, behind the aqueducts and amphitheaters, there were cities razed to their foundations, peoples reduced to ashes, millions of men and women turned into slaves, and spectacles where death was applauded as if it were an art. Rome didn't just build roads, it sewed corpses along them. It didn't only raise monuments, it also erected crosses as warnings. It didn't merely celebrate military victories, it perfected genocide as a political tool. History books often focus on the splendor, Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Trajan expanding the frontiers, Augustus inaugurating the Pax Romana. Yet rarely are we invited to look closely at what that glory truly cost. Because every empire feeds on something, and in Rome's case, its greatness was built on the blood of those who stood in its way. In this journey, we're going to unearth those shadows. We'll speak of entire cities wiped from the map, of rebellions crushed with thousands of bodies nailed to crosses, of arenas stained red in the name of entertainment, of religions persecuted with fire and torture, and of peoples condemned to eternal exile. This is not a tale meant to glorify, nor to judge with superiority from the present. It is a journey to understand that Roman civilization, for all its greatness, was also capable of atrocities that would have horrified even its contemporaries. And it is within that contrast that the true essence of Rome resides, a fascinating yet deeply human civilization, filled with lights and shadows we must face head-on. So prepare yourself, what we are about to tell are not marble anecdotes or legends of emperors. They are chronicles of horror, memories of victims, and testimonies of what happens when an empire decides its glory justifies any price. The sun beat mercilessly over the Mediterranean, and on the African coast, smoke darkened the horizon. There, where once rose gleaming temples, libraries overflowing with knowledge, and walls that seemed unbreakable, only the echoes of screams and the crackle of flames remained. That city was Carthage, the most feared rival of Rome, a power that for centuries had contested control of the sea and of trade. Carthage was no ordinary enemy. It was wealthy, powerful, with a naval fleet that had ruled the western Mediterranean, and with generals like Hannibal, men capable of humiliating the Roman legions in battles that still shake the memory, such as Cannae. For over 100 years, Rome and Carthage clashed in a series of wars that burned themselves into history, the Punic Wars. But by the time of the Third War, Rome was no longer seeking mere victory. It did not want peace, nor treaties, it wanted extermination. The Roman Senate decided that the very existence of Carthage was intolerable. The enemy had to vanish, not only militarily, but culturally and symbolically. Thus began an unrelenting siege, led by Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the famed Scipio Africanus. For nearly 3 years, the Carthaginians resisted heroically. With barely any food, tormented by hunger and despair, men, women, and children defended every stone, every alleyway, every inch of their city. But Rome was merciless. When the walls finally fell, what followed was not a mere military victory, it was a massacre. It is estimated that over 150,000 people were killed in just a few days. There was no mercy, temples were burned, soldiers slaughtered entire families, libraries were reduced to ash. The rest, some 50,000 souls of women, children, and the elderly, were chained and sold as slaves in Roman markets. The city that had once been the pride of Africa was turned into a silent graveyard. And Rome wanted to make sure no one forgot the message. According to tradition, Scipio Aemilianus ordered salt to be scattered over the ruins of Carthage, so that nothing would ever grow there again. It was not merely a practical act, it was a ritual of annihilation. Rome did not want a new enemy to rise from the ruins, it wanted to erase even the memory of Carthage, to tear it from the map and from human consciousness. Today, many modern historians have no hesitation in calling it by its true name, genocide, a systematic destruction of a people, their culture, their memory. For Rome, however, it was glory, eternal victory, a triumph so absolute that for centuries the suffering of the victims was barely mentioned. The greatness of the conqueror had silenced the pain of the conquered. But history does not forget so easily. Among the ashes of Carthage, the voices of those who fought to the end still echo, voices of those who died with dignity before the Roman Colossus. That silence turned into memory reminds us that imperial glory carried an incalculable price, the disappearance of entire civilizations, erased not by chance, but by the deliberate will to impose fear and absolute supremacy. Carthage was more than a defeated enemy, it was a symbol of what Rome was willing to do to secure its dominance. And that symbol was carved not in marble, but in the blood of thousands of innocents and in the poisoned earth where once flourished one of the most powerful cities of the ancient world. The Appian Way, known as the Queen of Roman Roads, was one of the most admired feats of engineering in the ancient world. It connected Rome with Capua and beyond, stretching like a river of stone that symbolized the power, organization, and progress of an empire that seemed invincible. But in 71 BC, that road became a stage of horror, a path of death lined with thousands of crosses, each bearing an agonizing body hanging beneath the relentless sun. It all began with one man, Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who had experienced firsthand the brutality of the Roman system. In 73 BC, he managed to escape with about 70 companions from the gladiator school in Capua. What began as a desperate flight soon turned into a massive rebellion. Crying out for freedom, thousands of slaves, peasants, and dispossessed men and women joined his cause. In just 2 years, Spartacus gathered an army of over 100,000 who faced, with a mixture of courage and despair, the almighty Roman legions. The so-called Servile War shook the entire republic. The rebels defeated several legions sent against them, humiliating a state that prided itself on its military discipline. Villas burned, nobles trembled, senators feared for the stability of Rome, the slaves had achieved the unthinkable, and their example ignited the spark of fear in the hearts of the powerful. Rome could not tolerate such an affront. That was when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most ambitious men of the Republic, took command of the suppression. Crassus was not a man of half measures. He knew that military victory would not be enough, he had to erase every trace of rebellion, to send a message that would freeze the blood of anyone who dared challenge the established order. After a series of bloody battles, Spartacus fell in combat. Thousands of his followers were captured. For them, there would be no mercy. Crassus ordered 6,000 prisoners to be crucified along nearly 200 kilometers of the Appian Way, from Capua to the gates of Rome. Imagine the sight, an endless line of crosses, twisted silhouettes stretching as far as the eye could see. On each, a body slowly agonized. Crucifixion was not a quick death, it was a calculated torment designed to prolong pain, to turn suffering into spectacle. The condemned hung for days, torn by nails, dehydrated, exposed to the cold of night and the scorching heat of day. Crows and vultures tore at still-living flesh, while travelers, merchants, and peasants walking the road were forced to behold the horror. The Appian Way, once a symbol of Roman genius, became a brutal reminder of the price of disobedience. It was not merely punishment, it was propaganda through terror. Rome wanted everyone to understand that no slave, no poor man, no conquered people could rise without facing unspeakable consequences. And it worked. The rebellion was crushed, and for generations the echo of those crosses served as a silent warning. The freedom dreamed of by Spartacus was reduced to corpses rotting under the sun, and the road that led to the capital of the empire became a path of shadows, an open-air cemetery that told a single story, that of an empire that ruled not only through law and armies, but through fear carved into collective memory. The Appian Way still stands today, walked by tourists who admire its ancient stones. But if one listens closely, beyond the murmurs of footsteps and the wind among the cypresses, one can almost hear the laments of those thousands who died hanging there, a reminder that the greatness of Rome was also written in blood spilled upon its own roads. The Colosseum, the theater of death. In the heart of Rome, among marble columns and statues of emperors, stood the building that best represented the duality of the empire, the Colosseum. On the outside, a colossal feat of engineering, a symbol of grandeur, power, and order. Inside, a stage where life and death became entertainment for tens of thousands of spectators. From dawn, crowds filled the stands. The Roman people came eagerly, not to hear poetry or contemplate philosophy, but to witness something far more primitive, blood as amusement. The Colosseum was not merely an amphitheater, it was a political machine, a space where the state offered bread and circuses to keep the people distracted, while reminding them that Rome held dominion over both life and death. The shows began with divinations, hunts featuring exotic beasts brought from the farthest corners of the empire. Tigers from Persia, lions from Africa, bears from Germania, even hippos and elephants paraded across the arena. There, hunters known as bestiarii faced them, sometimes armed, sometimes almost defenseless, in a brutal game that always ended with the sand stained red. It was not only a display of strength, it was a symbol of Rome's domination over nature and over the conquered lands from which those animals were taken. Then came the public executions. Criminals, prisoners of war, and even those condemned for political or religious reasons were thrown to the beasts, crucified in the arena, or burned alive in theatrical reenactments that blended myth and tragedy. Brutality was disguised as spectacle. For the spectators, it was not mere cruelty, it was justice served in blood, a reminder that the empire punished without mercy those who dared to disobey. Finally came the climax, the gladiators. Many were slaves or prisoners, trained in schools where they learned to kill or die for the glory of the crowd. Some fought in heavy armor, others with simple nets and daggers, facing opponents who often outmatched them in strength or number. The fights were regulated, but the line between sport and slaughter was razor-thin. When a gladiator fell, the crowd's thumbs, or the emperor's verdict, decided his fate, mercy or instant death. Not all gladiators were nameless. Some, through skill or charisma, achieved fame and were adored as heroes. But even they remained property of the empire, lives bought and sold, human commodities whose existence depended on the whims of the mob. For every celebrated fighter, thousands more died in silence, nameless, reduced to another entry in Rome's endless catalogue of blood offered to its people. The Colosseum was more than just a building, it was a mirror of the Roman soul. It represented an empire that had elevated violence to a ritual, that transformed death into collective entertainment, and that turned cruelty into a tool of political control. While the crowd shouted and cheered, and the emperors displayed their generosity by funding the games, social tensions were hidden beneath the roar of the multitude. Hunger, poverty, inequality, all were silenced, at least as long as the blood continued to flow in the arena. Today, those who visit the ruins of the Colosseum admire it as an architectural marvel. But beneath those stones still echo the screams, the roars of beasts, and the applause of a society that turned violence into spectacle. Rome called itself civilization, yet in its most famous amphitheater, it reminds us that power is often upheld not by ideas or laws, but by fear, blood, and glorified death. As Rome expanded its power across entire continents, its ambition was not limited to dominating territories and wealth, it also sought to control the thoughts, beliefs, and even the spirituality of its subjects. In that context arose an unexpected movement, small at first but increasingly defiant, Christianity. They preached values that were radical to the Roman mindset, equality among all men, humility, brotherhood, and one supreme God above emperors and their pagan deities. This not only contradicted Roman religious traditions but also endangered one of the empire's fundamental pillars, the worship of the emperor as a quasi-divine figure. At first, Christians were only a marginal minority. But in the eyes of power, they represented an ideological virus capable of undermining the absolute obedience that Rome demanded. Refusing to offer sacrifices to the official gods was not seen as a mere religious act, but as treason against the state. And Rome never forgave disobedience. The persecutions were brutal. Emperors found in the Christians the perfect enemy to blame for tragedies and calamities. The most famous case was that of Nero. In 64 AD, after the devastating fire that consumed much of Rome, the people demanded culprits. Unable to bear the pressure, Nero pointed to the Christians. It was the beginning of a literal hell. Hundreds of Christians were imprisoned and tortured in unimaginable ways. Some were crucified in public squares, others covered in pitch and turned into human torches to light the imperial gardens during night festivities. Others were thrown to wild beasts in amphitheaters amid laughter and cheers from crowds who watched their faith turned into a bloody spectacle. What was most disturbing was not only the violence, but the ritual behind it. The death of Christians was staged as a warning, a reminder that no creed could defy imperial power. Each execution was both punishment and theater. But Rome failed to foresee one essential detail: the more blood it spilled, the stronger the faith became. Christian martyrs did not renounce their beliefs at the final moment. Many died singing hymns, others proclaiming their faith aloud before executioners and spectators. Instead of extinguishing the movement, these public deaths transformed it into a flame impossible to put out. The stories of the martyrs began to circulate in secret, inspiring more people to join. What Rome had designed as a spectacle of terror became a powerful symbol of spiritual resistance. With each Christian executed, dozens of new believers were born. The persecution, meant to erase a religion, ended up planting the seed of a faith that centuries later would become the official religion of the empire itself. Rome, with its fire, had tried to silence an inconvenient voice, but all it achieved was to amplify it for eternity. Today, when we remember those Christians turned into human torches, we understand that their sacrifice was much more than an episode of imperial cruelty. It was the beginning of a cultural transformation that would change not only Rome, but the course of all Western civilization. Because, in the end, faith is not extinguished by fire, it is ignited by it. Jerusalem, the sacred city of the Jews, had for centuries been a symbol of spiritual resistance and identity. But in 70 AD, under the relentless power of Rome, it became the stage for one of the most heartbreaking episodes in ancient history. The conflict had begun a few years earlier. The Jewish people, subjected to Roman domination, were suffocated by heavy taxation, religious restrictions, and the constant presence of foreign soldiers in their streets. The tension grew until it erupted into open rebellion, the Great Jewish Revolt. For Rome, this was not merely a local uprising, it was a direct challenge to its authority and, worse still, a dangerous example for other provinces. Emperor Vespasian entrusted the mission of crushing the revolt to his son Titus, a harsh and pragmatic commander. The order was clear: Jerusalem must fall, and with it, all hope of independence. Rome sought not only to crush the rebels but to send a message to the rest of the empire: whoever rises against Rome will be wiped off the map. The siege began with surgical precision. The Romans blocked all entrances to the city, cut off supplies of water and food, and surrounded the walls with camps and fortifications. Inside, the population faced an even crueler enemy than the legions: hunger. Chronicles of the time recount unimaginable scenes of despair: families fighting over crumbs, mothers unable to feed their children, the sick abandoned in the streets. Those who tried to escape were captured and crucified before the walls as a warning. Dozens of crosses rose each day, visible to those still resisting inside, a reminder that there was no escape. Jerusalem had become an open-air prison. Finally, after months of resistance, the Romans managed to breach the walls. What followed was an indescribable massacre. The army swept through the streets with fire and sword. Thousands of men, women, and children were mercilessly killed. Temples burned. Homes were looted. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. The most devastating blow was the destruction of the Second Temple, the spiritual and cultural center of the Jewish people. That building was not just a place of worship, it was the very heart of Jewish identity. When the flames consumed it, the people lost far more than a structure: they lost their spiritual core, their point of unity, their symbol of hope. The historian Flavius Josephus, a witness to the disaster, described scenes that still shock today: streets covered with corpses, rivers of blood running between the stones, an unbearable stench that permeated the entire city. He estimated that over 1 million people died during the siege or were reduced to slavery. But perhaps the deepest wound was the diaspora. After the fall of Jerusalem, Rome scattered the Jews throughout the empire, uprooting them from their ancestral land. That act not only destroyed a city, it broke a people and forced them to live through centuries of exile. The destruction of Jerusalem was, for Rome, a triumph. For the world, it was a tragedy that marked the history of religions, peoples, and collective memory. Today, when we look at the stones that remain of the ancient temple, we remember that the power of the greatest empire could not erase the faith or identity of a people. Jerusalem burned, yes, but from those ashes emerged a story of resistance that still resonates thousands of years later. The Roman Empire left us aqueducts, laws, roads, and monuments that still defy time. But behind that facade of marble and grandeur lies a darker truth: Rome was built as much with blood, terror, and subjugation as with engineering and discipline. Carthage was wiped off the map forever. The slaves crucified along the Appian Way reminded the world that freedom came at a brutal price. In the Colosseum, death became entertainment. Christians burned as human torches in the name of faith. Jerusalem was reduced to ashes, with an entire people dispersed for generations. Rome was not just civilization. It was also an empire. And every empire, behind its glory, hides victims. This is not about denying what Rome contributed to the world, but about acknowledging its complexity. The light of its greatness can only be understood if we also see the shadow of its atrocities. And perhaps therein lies the most important lesson: no empire, no matter how powerful it seems, is eternal. The peoples Rome tried to erase still live on in memory, while the empire itself fell. Because stones crumble, but the stories of those who resisted continue to resonate. So the next time you gaze upon the ruins of the Colosseum or the remnants of a Roman road, remember, they are not just witnesses to glory, they are witnesses to suffering. And telling these stories is the only way to ensure that those voices, which Rome sought to silence, never die completely.